Okay, imagine Canada, right? But not just the country we know today. Think about a land with human history stretching back at least 11,500 years.
11 millennia. It's quite staggering.
Exactly. So today on the Deep Dive, we're looking at this brief history of Canada source you brought. We want to, dig out the really key insights, the surprising stuff about how this country developed. Forget just dates and names. We're trying to really understand that journey from the very first people right up to, well, modern Canada.
And what's really amazing about Canadian history is just the sheer scale, isn't it? Time, geography. It's vast.
Right.
Our source really tries to weave all that together, how the land itself, those huge distances shaped communities, but also, the ongoing Indigenous story, global events pressing in.
So the mission is sort of finding the main themes, the big clashes, the paradoxes that are still relevant.
That's the idea, getting to the heart of what makes Canada, well, Canada.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. 11,500 years ago. It's hard to even picture. The thinking is, people first came over the Bering Strait, the Paleo-Eskimo period.
That's the current understanding, yes. Nomadic hunters following herds, caribou, mammoths, experts in their environment.
This incredible resilience moving across that landscape and how they must have shaped things from the very start.
Absolutely. And they adapted so quickly over millennia to all these incredibly different environments. Our source mentions the distinct cultural areas, Arctic, subarctic, northeast, northwest coasts, the plains.
And completely different ways of living evolved in each.
Totally. Think about, say, the Iroquois and Longhouse communities in the northeast, very focused on kinship, group decisions. Then compare that to maybe the more mobile band structures of Athabascan peoples further north.
Different landscapes, different societies.
Exactly. And by the early Holocene, that's after the last big ice age, the population across North America might have been as high as 5 million people.
Wow, 5 million. That really changes the perspective on European arrival, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It wasn't an empty continent.
And calling them just hunter-gatherers feels, well, inadequate. The source mentions things like buffalo jumps, complex tracking, Inuit sea hunting.
Right. These were highly sophisticated systems for acquiring, producing, distributing food. Far from simple. It shows a deep, intricate connection to their lands long before Europeans showed up.
And languages. So much diversity mentioned. Algonquian, Iroquoian, Siouan.
A huge diversity. And language wasn't just communication. It carried worldviews, identity. Think about the Salesian languages on the coast, so complex, reflecting deep understanding of nature, social ties.
Even place names, like Quebec City meaning where the river narrows in Algonquin.
It's a direct link right there in the name, a reminder of that deep history.
But then the story takes that really difficult turn, European contact. Our source calls it a sad and tragic tragedy for Indigenous peoples.
And the consequences are still felt today. The fur trade imposing foreign laws, undermining their own governance systems.
And taking land through treaties that were, well, fundamentally unfair.
Yeah.
Based on this idea of unused land.
Yes, a systematic dispossession justified by European concepts that just didn't align with Indigenous realities. It was a deliberate dismantling of existing societies.
It's crucial to see it from that angle.
And yet the source also stresses the resilience. Indigenous cultures adapted, resisted. They weren't just passively swept aside.
They found ways to keep going.
Exactly. Ancient art, the languages, the place names, they all speak to that enduring presence, their fundamental role in shaping Canada.
Okay, shifting gears to the Europeans. What drove them? It wasn't just exploration for its own sake, right?
No, not at all. It was tied up with huge shifts in Europe. The Reformation, the Renaissance, new scientific ideas changing how they saw the world, and of course the promise of trade, wealth.
The classic motivators.
And we often jump to Cartier, but the Norse were here much earlier. Bjarne Harulfsen spotting land, Leif Erikson landing in Newfoundland around 1001.
Right, Lanso Meadows. That physical evidence.
Concrete proof. Probably a base camp, maybe for repairs or exploration, not a permanent settlement. Dated around AD 1021.
And dating it was tricky initially, something about the carbon dating.
Yeah, early methods had wider margins, potential contamination issues. But the consensus now points firmly to the end of the first millennium.
Still, incredible they made it that far.
Absolutely. But it was really the French, starting with Jacques Cartier in 1534, who brought this region into the main European focus, claiming land for France, those first interactions with Indigenous peoples.
Which were complex, right? Trade, curiosity, but also conflict.
A real mix. And Cartier actually tried to document Indigenous beliefs and societies, though obviously through his own European filter.
And then the British arrive. and the competition starts heating up. Hudson's Bay Company, 1670, all about the fur trade.
Primarily, yes, and that massively changed the role of indigenous peoples. They became essential middlemen, but also vulnerable to exploitation, shifting trade terms.
And those early maps showing what they hoped to find, like the Northwest Passage, not what was actually there.
Definitely. Ambition often outpaced reality. Which leads us into the colonial era proper. You've got the French along the St. Lawrence, the English on the coast, even Spanish influence creeping up from the south.
But it really becomes France versus Britain in the 17th century.
Constantly escalating rivalry, culminating in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War as it was known elsewhere. Britain wins, gets huge territories, including New France, by 1763.
And suddenly you have this large French-speaking Catholic population under British Protestant rule. A massive shift.
A profound shift. And the source contrasts the different ways things were run. British colonies had representative assemblies, mostly British Protestants. But in Quebec, French Catholics became, well, a distinct society, often facing marginalization under British administration.
That difference seems key to everything that follows.
It really is. Then comes the American Revolution. Most British colonies stay loyal. French Canada stays neutral.
But Britain holds on to Canada, despite American ambitions looking north.
Right. And looking inside New France before that British takeover, you had things like the Compagnie des Saints Associés trying to boost settlement, the seigneurial land system.
Ah, yes, the seigneuries, where the Lord grants land to tenants.
Exactly. And a big role for priests, soldiers. Plus, the Métis emerged people of mixed Indigenous and European heritage who naturally resisted British control. New France grew, but it was always vulnerable in those big European wars.
And that resistance to assimilation in Quebec starts early.
Very early. It's a core part of that bicultural identity. Then, after the British win, they try to consolidate power. They bring in English institutions, white loyalists arrive fleeing the U.S.
And they divide Canada into Upper and Lower Canada, basically cementing that cultural divide.
Pretty much. It formalized it. The British were nervous about losing Canada, so there were internal migrations. New Brunswick was carved out partly for defensibility. Economically, timber booms in Upper Canada. Montreal starts to industrialize.
And conflict wasn't just between Britain and France, right? There were internal revolts, indigenous alliances.
All sorts of shifting alliances and conflicts. The Quebec Act in 1774, meant to appease French Canadians, actually angered the American colonists. Later, you get rebellions in Upper Canada in 1837, groups like the Hunters' Lodges popping up. Lots of tension.
Which eventually leads toward Confederation. Was it inevitable, or were there other options on the table, like joining the U.S.?
There were definitely voices advocating for annexation, but political movements for federation grew stronger. Conservatives, mostly Anglican, worried about the growing power of Catholic, French-speaking society, and the liberals.
And the American Civil War had an unexpected effect, weakening Canadian conservatives.
An interesting side effect, yeah. But the key figures pushing for Confederation were Sir John A. Macdonald and Sir George Etienne Cartier. Their political skill in bridging divides was essential.
They were the architects.
Absolutely. And the Charlottetown Conference in 1864 was the turning point. It started as a maritime union discussion.
But then the Province of Canada delegation, led by George Brown, proposed a bigger union.
Exactly. They sold the grand design. New Brunswick was keen. Nova Scotia got interested. They agreed to meet again in Quebec to hammer out the details.
So the momentum built through these conferences.
Definitely. There was opposition for sure, but these meetings were crucial. The Quebec Conference produced the resolutions, the blueprint. Critically, they chose a parliamentary system, not a U.S.-style presidential one.
A defining choice. And then 1867, the Dominion of Canada is born. Upper and Lower Canada become Ontario and Quebec, joined by Nova Scotia and New Brunswick.
Through the British North America Act, or BNA Act, and crucially, it was designed as a decentralized union. Strong provincial powers were a key compromise to avoid the political gridlock they'd seen before.
So it wasn't just imposed by Britain.
No, it grew out of events in British North America, reflecting local realities, even loyalty to Britain. The Prince of Wales visited around then. It included things like an elected legislative council and the requirement for both languages in law and business.
And most provinces agreed, though Newfoundland held out for a long time.
Right, they joined much later, in 1949. But after 1867, Canada starts expanding rapidly, acquiring huge northern territories from Britain, buying Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company.
BC joins in 71, PEI in 73.
Yeah.
The map starts to look more familiar.
It does. But governing this new, vast country was tough. Balancing regional needs, finding leaders everyone trusted. MacDonald was central to holding it together. And that huge project, the Transcontinental Railway, essential, but plagued with problems.
Legislative, financial hurdles.
You name it, it was a massive undertaking.
Let's circle back to Indigenous peoples and this new Canadian state. The source uses strong words: competition and dispossession, colonial fabrication.
It's a stark framing, highlighting the fundamental conflict over land and sovereignty that was built into Canada's formation. Indigenous nations had their own systems, their own territories.
Which Canadian law basically ignored or actively undermined, the Indian Act restricting rights and movement.
Historically, yes. It denied title, restricted freedoms. This led to generations of court battles over treaty rights and land claims, which are still ongoing, and these are inherently political negotiations.
And Canada lacks a clear, final authority for settling these treaty disputes. No equivalent to the U.S. Supreme Court in this specific area.
According to the source, there isn't that single definitive body like the old Indian Claims Commission either, although courts have increasingly recognized the foundational nature of treaties, like the Alberta Court of Appeal ruling mentioned.
And the impact of losing land wasn't just economic, was it? It hit culture, language, self-governance.
Profoundly. It undermined everything. The source argues for a reparative approach now, focused on rebuilding Indigenous capacity, supporting self-determination, because historically the goal of the state was often to liquidate that land base.
And then the residential schools, described as aiming for assimilation and Indian extinction, just devastating.
Horrific. The source acknowledges resistance, but the system caused immense lasting harm, destroying identities, severing connections. The trauma echoes through generations.
And the debate continues over who was ultimately responsible: government, churches.
It's a complex and painful legacy that demands ongoing attention and action towards reconciliation.
Shifting now to the World Wars. Canada's contribution, especially in WWI, was huge for its size, right? Over 416,000 volunteers.
A massive commitment. And the cost was terrible, around 61,000 killed in WWI.
But that experience, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, it helps forge a distinct Canadian identity, separate from Britain.
Very much so. Initial enthusiasm faded with the horrors of the war, but Canada came out with a stronger international reputation. Signing the Treaty of Versailles independently was a big step towards autonomy.
And in WWII, Canada mobilized completely. Total war economy.
Yes, massive industrial production for the war effort. The economy grew dramatically, and it shifted Canada's economic focus, strengthening ties with the U.S., becoming less reliant solely on Britain.
And after the war, Canada steps onto the world stage, helping found the UN, becoming a middle power.
Exactly. Advocating for peace, contributing significantly to UN peacekeeping, NATO, NORAD, playing roles in Korea, the Suez Crisis. That was a major moment for Canadian-led peacekeeping.
A real shift from maybe some pre-war ambivalence about global involvement.
Definitely. There was renewed hope invested in the UN after the failures of the League of Nations.
Let's talk social changes. 1967 seems like a watershed year. Centennial, yes, but also lots of activism.
A real explosion. First Nations protests, wildcat strikes, the rise of feminism, environmentalism, gay rights, stronger unions, challenging the status quo, demanding change. Social sciences were gaining influence too.
The new left emerging.
Yes, perhaps more fragmented in Canada than elsewhere, but definitely pushing for change. And women's suffrage, the source, links it to women's education, finding their public voice, moving beyond just seeing women as victims.
But it wasn't always inclusive, right?
Right.
Mainly middle-class white women leading the charge initially.
That's a valid critique highlighted in the source, though some suffragists did try to broaden the movement's scope later on.
Then post-70s, a bigger push for civil rights for everyone. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms in '82 being key.
Hugely important. Ratifying international conventions against discrimination, then enshrining rights in the Charter. It became a tool for peaceful protest. And more recently, movements like Black Lives Matter, forcing Canada to confront its own history of anti-Black racism and slavery.
And the Indigenous rights movement really gaining steam from the 60s onwards.
Yes, challenging assimilation, asserting rights to land, resources, self-government. Big court cases like Delgamuukw were pivotal in getting Aboriginal title recognized, opening doors for modern treaties.
And advocacy from Indigenous women's groups, Inuit rights. It's an ongoing struggle.
Absolutely. Experimenting with different forms of self-governance, pushing for justice and recognition.
Okay, economics. By the mid-'80s, Canada's economy had grown a lot more market-focused, but also uncertain times, inflation, oil prices.
Significant growth, yes, but also a lot of anxiety. Fluctuating dollar, stock market worries. Policy shifted towards more free market thinking. More cooperation between government and business was seen as needed.
Going back further, the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century transformed Canada, fueled by mass immigration.
The Great Wave, starting in the 1840s, changed Canada from agrarian to urban industrial. But it was tough for many working-class immigrants. Harsh conditions, sweatshops.
And then the Great Depression hit Canada hard, too.
Devastatingly hard. Overproduction, stock market crash, plus drought on the prairies, mass unemployment, shanty towns, protests like the On to Ottawa trek, a period of real hardship.
And the source knows Canada's modern economy maybe lacks those single iconic figures like in the U.S. and faces challenges governing such a huge, diverse country.
Yeah, a sense of continuity maybe, and always being influenced by bigger global events.
Culturally, the source really emphasizes diversity as a strength, warning against homogenization.
Very strongly. Canada as a mosaic, not melting pot, valuing different voices, preserving languages because they carry worldviews. Quebec's distinct culture is seen as adding value to the whole country.
And that second wave of immigration, British Isles, Scandinavia, Germany, shaped the East and the West, helped by the railways.
Big impact on settlement patterns. And the source mentions the sheer beauty of the Canadian landscape, that grand natural vista, as being central to the Canadian identity, inspiring arts and literature.
And multiculturalism becoming official policy in 1971.
Yes, based on the Bilingualism and Biculturalism Commission. Politically motivated partly by Quebec's separatism needing support from other ethnic groups, Trudeau's announcement, no official culture, equality for all citizens.
Laid the groundwork for things like the Multiculturalism Act.
Exactly. It reflected changing demographics, moving away from older racist immigration laws, a gradual shift towards institutionalizing diversity.
And Canada's role in the world, always balancing domestic needs and foreign expectations.
Seems to be a constant theme. Unique in getting foreign policy powers early, supporting the League of Nations, expanding diplomacy between the wars, then emerging as that middle power after WWII, though that status is debated today.
Early foreign policy was a bit cautious, but cooperation with the U.S., especially in defense.
Yes, North Atlantic security, aerospace cooperation, quietly building ties in Latin America too. Joining the UN led to more enthusiastic global engagement, like Suez. Later, maybe a shift towards a more pragmatic, relational approach.
And always committed to multilateralism, working through international organizations.
Generally, yes. Involvement in environmental issues, navigating the complex U.S.-China relationship impacting everyone now.
And peacekeeping is such a big part of Canada's image.
It is. Evolved from being part of the British Empire's forces to developing its own identity through military service, then really leaning into the UN peacekeeping role after WWII, especially Suez. It's become part of the national story, even with changes in military culture over time.
Lastly, trade. That rejected U.S. trade deal in 1870, but later accepted due to economic pressures, railways playing a role.
Economic realities, railway rivalries push towards accepting closer ties eventually, helping consolidate the country after Confederation. Bringing in the prairies in BC raised continental economic questions. The higher U.S. standard of living was always a factor.
Always that debate. Closer ties with the U.S. or Britain.
A recurring theme. Even events like the U.S. annexation of Hawaii had ripple effects on Canadian trade policy back then.
Which brings us right up to today. The source points to climate change and Indigenous reconciliation as the big challenges.
Absolutely pressing issues. Canada's high per capita emissions, its complex record on climate agreements like Kyoto.
Versus the reality of rising temperatures, wildfires, floods impacting the country directly.
And reconciliation. The source details that long, damaging history of government policies, wars, assimilation attempts, residential schools, denying rights. The legacy is deep.
But Indigenous nations have survived, are pushing for self-governance. Reports like the TRC, the Royal Commission, laid bare the truth.
Yes, and protests against pipelines, the focus on implementing rights, it's all part of that ongoing struggle for justice and a different future. Meaningful reconciliation requires action from everyone, Indigenous and non-Indigenous.
So wrapping this deep dive up, it's clear Canada's history is incredibly layered. Indigenous resilience, colonial impacts, cultural negotiation, finding its place in the world.
It's a story full of contradictions and ongoing evolution. You've really gotten a sense of those key forces and tensions that shaped the country.
Hopefully you, the listener, feel you have a much richer understanding now of how Canada came to be.
And thinking about the source's conclusion that Canada remains, in a way, unsolved, constantly being made and unmade, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do we today contribute to that ongoing story?
That's a great question to leave everyone with. And of course, if any part of this sparked your interest, the early history, specific movements, contemporary issues, there's always so much more to explore.